A bear cub finds a young woman to save his injured mother, but what they face in the forest is breathtaking. Deep in the heart of Oregon's Klamath Forest, where ancient pines whispered secrets to the wind, Max, a young brown bear, lived in perfect harmony with his mother. Their days flowed like the crystal-clear streams that cut through the wilderness, each moment filled with lessons that would ensure Max's survival in the wild. His mother, a magnificent creature with eyes that held the wisdom of generations, taught him everything from finding the sweetest berries to catching the most elusive fish in the rushing waters. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Let us know which city you're watching us from. Stay tuned. The forest was their kingdom, a vast expanse of green where every tree had a story to tell and every path led to new adventures. Max learned quickly, his curious nature making him an eager student. He memorized the subtle changes in the wind that warned of approaching storms, the different bird calls that announced the time of day, and the secret spots where the juiciest salmon gathered during spawning season. Their mornings would begin with careful explorations of their territory. Max's mother would demonstrate the art of using his powerful sense of smell to detect both opportunities and dangers. She showed him how to distinguish between the harmless scent of deer and the more concerning presence of other predators. These lessons were interwoven with moments of pure joy, as they played in sunlit clearings or cooled off in hidden pools during the heat of summer days. However, the serenity of their world began to shift one autumn morning. The air carried unfamiliar scents, and the forest's usual symphony of sounds had changed. The birds had fallen silent, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Max's mother became increasingly alert, her movements more cautious, her teachings more urgent. She sensed what Max was too young to understand: their paradise was being threatened. Strange metallic sounds echoed through the trees, accompanied by voices that didn't belong to the forest. The peaceful rhythm of their life was disrupted by the arrival of hunters who saw the wilderness not as a home to be respected, but as a resource to be exploited. They left behind traces of their presence: disturbed undergrowth, unfamiliar footprints, and most alarmingly, devices that glinted menacingly in the filtered sunlight. Max's mother intensified their lessons, now focusing on avoiding these new dangers. She taught him to recognize the sound of approaching vehicles, the scent of human presence, and most importantly, how to stay hidden when these intruders came near. But despite her best efforts to protect their way of life, the hunter's presence grew more persistent, their intrusions more frequent. One fateful day, while teaching Max how to find honey in a hollow tree, his mother encountered one of the hunter's traps. The incident left her severely injured, unable to move freely through their beloved forest. Max found himself facing an impossible choice: stay by his mother's side or venture out to find help in a world that suddenly seemed much larger and more dangerous than before. In the midst of this crisis, Emily's cabin stood as a beacon of hope, though Max didn't know it yet. Emily, a middle-aged woman who had retreated to the forest's edge after experiencing her own loss, lived in solitude, finding solace in the simple rhythms of nature. She had no idea that her quiet existence was about to be dramatically interrupted by a desperate young bear who would change her life forever. The forest, which had always been Emily's refuge, held its breath as these separate lives were about to intersect. The woman who had chosen isolation to heal her wounds would soon find herself drawn into a story of survival, courage, and unexpected connections. The peaceful sounds of nature were gradually being replaced by the tension of impending confrontation, as the hunters continued their activities, unaware that their actions would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everyone's beliefs about survival, compassion, and the true meaning of humanity. In her cabin, Emily went about her daily routines, tending to her small garden and gathering firewood, unaware that she was about to be thrust into an adventure that would require every ounce of her strength and courage. The forest around her seemed to whisper warnings of the changes to come, but like most humans, she couldn't yet understand its ancient language. Emily's morning ritual was interrupted by an unusual commotion outside her cabin. The birds had stopped their cheerful songs, replaced by an eerie silence that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She placed her steaming cup of herbal tea on the wooden table and approached the window cautiously. The forest, usually a peaceful backdrop to her solitary life, seemed different that morning, more alive, more urgent in its warnings. 5 years had passed since she'd chosen this isolated life after losing her husband. The cabin, once a weekend getaway, had become her sanctuary. She'd learned to read the forest's moods, to anticipate storms by watching the way the leaves turned their silver undersides to the sky, to know when autumn was approaching by the changing patterns of bird migrations. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for what she was about to encounter. The sound came again, a mix between a grunt and a whimper, something distinctly animal, yet filled with an almost human-like desperation. Emily's heart raced as she debated whether to investigate. Her years in the forest had taught her to respect its wild inhabitants from a distance, but something about this sound spoke directly to her soul, awakening the part of her that had been dormant since her loss. With trembling hands, she reached for her heavy wool sweater and stepped onto the porch. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and recent rain. As she scanned the tree line, movement caught her eye, a large brown shape emerging from the undergrowth. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she realized she was face to face with a young brown bear. Her first instinct was to retreat inside, but something stopped her. The bear's eyes held an intelligence and desperation that transfixed her. It moved with an unusual urgency, not aggressive but clearly agitated. Emily had seen bears before, always from a safe distance, but this one was different. It seemed to be trying to communicate something. Max, for his part, had followed his instincts to Emily's cabin. The scent of her garden, the smoke from her chimney, and most importantly, the absence of the harsh metallic smells that accompanied the hunters had drawn him there. He needed help, and something deep within him recognized Emily as his best hope. The next few moments stretched like honey dripping from a comb. Emily stood perfectly still, her heart pounding so loud she was sure it must be audible across the clearing. The bear, Max, made a soft sound, then took a step backward, looking over his shoulder before returning his gaze to her. The gesture was so clearly intentional that Emily felt her fear begin to transform into curiosity. "What is it?" she whispered, more to herself than to the bear. "What are you trying to tell me?" Max took another step back, then forward again, his behavior so unlike anything Emily had ever read about or experienced with wild animals. She noticed he was staying just at the edge of the forest, as if inviting her to follow, but refusing to come closer to the cabin. The morning light filtered through the canopy, creating dappled patterns on Max's fur. Emily noticed how young he appeared, probably not more than a couple of years old. His movements, though urgent, showed no sign of aggression. Instead, there was something almost pleading in his demeanor. Emily's mind raced back to the changes she'd noticed in the forest over the past few weeks. The unusual sounds that carried on the wind, the unfamiliar tire tracks she'd spotted on her walks, the distant echoes that might have been gunshots. She'd dismissed these signs, choosing to remain in her bubble of solitude, but now they seemed to take on new significance. Without fully understanding why, Emily found herself stepping off the porch. Every survival instinct screamed at her to return to the safety of her cabin, but another voice, one that spoke of connection and purpose, urged her forward. She had come to the forest to hide from the world, but perhaps the forest itself was now asking something of her. Max watched her approach, his dark eyes fixed on her every movement. When she reached the edge of her cleared yard, he made that soft sound again and took several steps into the forest before looking back at her expectantly. The message was clear. Follow me. Emily hesitated at the invisible line between her safe, controlled world and the wild unknown of the forest. The bear waited patiently, as if understanding her internal struggle. A crow called overhead, its harsh cry seeming to echo the urgency of the moment. In that instant, Emily realized that her years of isolation had been leading to this moment, this choice between remaining in her comfortable solitude or answering the call of something larger than herself. Emily's decision to follow Max into the forest marked the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself and the wilderness she called home. With each step deeper into the woods, the familiar landmarks that had defined her daily life began to fade away. The forest she thought she knew revealed itself as something far more complex and mysterious. She had grabbed her backpack before leaving, thankful for her habit of keeping it stocked with essentials: water, a first aid kit, some trail mix, and a flashlight. The morning sun filtered through the canopy above, creating shifting patterns on the forest floor, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the light seemed different today, more ominous than comforting. Max led the way with surprising patience, maintaining a steady pace that Emily could follow while staying just far enough ahead to guide her. Every few minutes, he would stop and look back, making sure she was still there. The connection between them grew stronger with each such gesture, though Emily still couldn't quite believe she was following a wild bear through the forest. The terrain began to change as they moved deeper into unfamiliar territory. The well-worn paths Emily knew gave way to rougher ground, and the vegetation grew denser. She noticed signs that made her increasingly uneasy: broken branches that didn't appear to be damaged by natural causes, disturbed earth that suggested heavy boots had passed through recently, and most worryingly, the occasional glint of metal partially hidden among the undergrowth. "These are traps," Emily whispered to herself, her heart racing as she recognized the cruel devices for what they were. Her years of solitude had taught her about the various threats to wildlife, but seeing these implements firsthand filled her with a mixture of anger and fear. She began to understand why Max had sought her help, and the realization made her more determined to continue. As they progressed, Emily started noticing other details that spoke of human intrusion into this pristine wilderness. Cigarette butts carelessly discarded, the remains of campfires that hadn't been properly extinguished, and torn pieces of plastic that didn't belong in this ancient forest. The pristine sanctuary she had come to know was being violated by those who saw it only as a resource to be exploited. Max's behavior became more cautious as they ventured further. He would stop more frequently, raising his head to test the air and listening intently to the forest's sounds. Emily found herself mimicking his alertness, becoming more attuned to the wilderness around her. The bird calls she had always taken for granted now carried new meaning. Their sudden silence could signal danger. They came to a small stream where Max paused longer than usual. Emily took the opportunity to refill her water bottle, watching as the young bear seemed to be deciding something. The water's gentle murmur couldn't quite mask the tension in the air. As she knelt by the stream, Emily noticed fresh boot prints in the mud. Someone had passed through here recently. The sound of a distant engine made them both freeze. Max's ears pricked forward, and Emily felt her muscles tense. The noise grew louder, then faded again, but its message was clear. They weren't alone in this part of the forest. Emily realized that what had once been her place of refuge had become a battlefield of sorts, where the interests of wildlife and those who would harm them collided. As they resumed their journey, the forest seemed to close in around them. The paths became narrower, forcing Emily to push through thick undergrowth. She accumulated scratches on her hands and face, but the urgency in Max's demeanor kept her moving forward. The young bear was leading her somewhere specific, and the increasing signs of human activity suggested they were approaching something significant. They came across a clearing that made Emily's blood run cold. Here, the hunters had clearly made camp recently. The remains of their fire were still warm, and various pieces of equipment lay scattered about. Most disturbing were the maps spread out on a makeshift table, marked with X's and circles that suggested a systematic plan to trap the forest's wildlife. Emily quickly photographed the maps with her phone, knowing this evidence might be crucial later. As she did so, she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. The area they were heading toward was heavily marked, suggesting it was a focal point for the hunters' activities. The reality of what she had gotten herself into began to sink in. Max grew increasingly agitated as they left the clearing behind, his movements becoming more urgent. The forest around them had changed character entirely. This was old growth, where the trees stood like ancient guardians and the undergrowth was sparse enough to move through more easily. But the signs of human interference were more pronounced here, suggesting this area was a prime target for the hunters. The late morning sun had climbed higher in the sky when a sound stopped Emily and Max in their tracks. It was a desperate rustling, accompanied by soft, distressed noises that didn't belong to the forest's natural symphony. Max tensed, his ears forward, but instead of showing fear, he looked at Emily expectantly, as if this was something she needed to see. Following the sound, they came upon a heartbreaking sight. A young deer was caught in one of the hunter's traps, its leg entangled in a cruel snare. The animal's eyes were wide with fear, its breathing rapid and shallow. Emily felt her chest tighten with emotion. This was exactly the kind of suffering she had come to the forest to escape, yet here it was, demanding her attention. "Easy there, easy," Emily whispered, slowly approaching the trapped deer. Her voice, though soft, carried years of compassion that had been buried beneath her own grief. The deer watched her with terrified eyes but seemed to sense her peaceful intention. Max stayed back, understanding instinctively that his presence might frighten the deer more. Emily's hands trembled as she examined the trap. It was a complex mechanism designed to hold its prey without immediate harm, clearly meant to keep animals alive until the hunters returned. The thought made her stomach turn. She had to act quickly, knowing that every moment spent here increased their risk of discovery. Drawing on skills she didn't even know she possessed, Emily began working on the trap. Her fingers, though shaking, found their purpose as she carefully manipulated the mechanism. The deer remained surprisingly still, as if understanding that this human was different from those who had set the trap. "Just a little more," she murmured, more to steady herself than to comfort the deer. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool air. Every snap of a twig in the forest around them made her heart jump, expecting to see hunters emerging from the trees at any moment. Finally, with a soft click, the trap released its hold. The deer scrambled to its feet, stumbling slightly before finding its balance. It paused for just a moment, its dark eyes meeting Emily's in what seemed like a gesture of gratitude, before bounding away into the safety of the forest. The entire encounter lasted only minutes, but Emily felt fundamentally changed by it. As she stood up, brushing dirt from her knees, a new awareness settled over her. The forest had always been her escape, her hiding place from the world's cruelties. But now she realized that even here, in this supposed sanctuary, there was work to be done, wrongs to be righted, and creatures who needed help. Max watched the entire scene with an intelligence that continued to surprise Emily. His presence seemed to carry a question. Having helped one creature in distress, would she continue on to help another? The young bear's own urgency had never wavered, reminding Emily that their journey was far from over. However, their act of mercy had not gone unnoticed. As they moved away from the trap site, Emily began to notice signs that made her skin prickle with apprehension. Fresh boot prints in the soft earth, broken twigs that suggested recent human passage, and most worryingly, the distant sound of voices carried on the wind. The hunters had been monitoring their traps more closely than she'd realized. Emily's interference would not go undetected for long. She and Max needed to move quickly now, but they also needed to be more cautious than ever. The forest, which had seemed like a vast expanse of safety just hours ago, now felt like a maze where danger could lurk behind every tree. They began to move more carefully through the undergrowth, with Max leading them on a winding path that seemed designed to confuse any followers. Emily found herself paying attention to details she'd never noticed before, the way certain plants could be passed through without leaving a trace, how to step on rocks instead of soft earth to avoid leaving footprints, the importance of staying downwind from potential threats. The afternoon light had taken on a golden quality, filtering through the canopy in shafts that would have been beautiful if not for the tension in the air. Emily's muscles ached from the unaccustomed exercise and constant vigilance, but she pressed on. The image of the trapped deer kept returning to her mind, strengthening her resolve to help Max with whatever crisis had driven him to seek human assistance. As they traveled, Emily began to notice a change in the forest's character. The trees were older here, their trunks massive and gnarled with age. The undergrowth was thinner, making movement easier, but also leaving them more exposed. Max's behavior became increasingly alert, his every movement suggesting they were approaching something significant. The air felt different too, heavier with purpose and anticipation. The sound of a branch snapping nearby sent Emily and Max ducking behind a fallen log. Their hearts pounding in unified rhythm, they waited as footsteps approached. Through the dense foliage, Emily caught glimpses of a weathered cabin she hadn't known existed in this remote part of the forest. The footsteps belonged to a man emerging from the structure, tall, gray-haired, with the watchful movements of someone who had spent a lifetime in the wilderness. This was Hank, though Emily didn't know it yet. The former forest ranger moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew every inch of his territory. His cabin, nearly invisible among the ancient trees, was a testament to his desire to remain unseen, to fade into the forest he had once officially protected. The years had etched deep lines into his face, each one a story of confrontations with those who would harm his beloved wilderness. Emily held her breath as Hank scanned the area, his experienced eyes searching for anything out of place. Max, surprisingly, showed no fear. Instead, the young bear seemed to be assessing the man with the same intelligence he had shown in leading Emily this far. The tension in the air was palpable as Hank's gaze swept past their hiding place. "You might as well come out," Hank called suddenly, his voice rough from lack of use. "I've been watching you for the past 10 minutes. Emily's heart jumped into her throat. She slowly stood, hands raised to show she meant no harm. Max remained by her side, his presence both comforting and surreal. Hank's eyes widened slightly at the sight of the bear, but he showed no fear, only a deep, understanding surprise. "Never seen anything quite like that," he muttered, gesturing to the unlikely pair they made. "Bears not acting natural, leading you here like this. Something's wrong in my forest." The possessive way he said "my forest" told Emily volumes about who this man was and what this place meant to him. She took a cautious step forward, sensing that this encounter could be either help or hindrance to their urgent mission. "I'm Emily," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "And you're right, something is very wrong. There are hunters in the forest, setting traps, causing destruction. This bear, he came to my cabin seeking help. His mother is injured." Hank's weathered face darkened at the mention of hunters. He absently rubbed a scar on his left arm, a permanent reminder of his last confrontation with those who saw the forest as nothing more than a hunting ground. The memory of that day still haunted him. The sound of shots, the feeling of helplessness, the decision to walk away from his badge rather than face his own failure to protect the wilderness he loved. "Can't help you," he said gruffly, turning back toward his cabin. "Those men are dangerous. Best thing you can do is go back to wherever you came from and let nature take its course." But Emily wasn't so easily dismissed. "Nature's course has been interrupted by human cruelty," she called after him. "You know these woods better than anyone. You must know where they set their traps, their patterns, their movements." Hank stopped, his hand on the cabin door. The words seemed to hit him like physical blows, each one striking at the conscience he'd tried to silence. Max chose that moment to approach the cabin, moving with deliberate care, his eyes fixed on Hank with an almost pleading expression. Inside his cabin, Hank's walls were covered with maps of the forest, marked with notes and observations accumulated over years of vigilance. Even after leaving his official post, he had never stopped watching, never stopped recording the movements of both wildlife and those who would harm them. His self-imposed exile hadn't been about escaping responsibility, it had been about finding a different way to protect what he loved. "Those hunters," he said finally, not turning around. "They're not just weekend sportsmen. They're organized, methodical. They've been expanding their operation for months now, pushing deeper into protected areas. I've been watching them, documenting everything." Emily moved closer, hope rising in her chest. "Then help us, not by confronting them, but by helping us avoid them. Show us a safe path to reach Max's mother." Hank turned slowly, his eyes moving from Emily to Max and back again. The bear's presence seemed to awaken something in him, a memory of why he'd become a ranger in the first place, of the connection between humans and wildlife that had once given his life meaning. "There's a network of old logging trails," he said finally, moving to one of his maps. "Overgrown now, but still passable if you know where to look. The hunters stick to newer paths, easier terrain, but if you're willing to take the harder route..." His fingers traced a line on the map, showing a winding path through the most challenging parts of the forest. Emily felt a surge of gratitude, but also noticed how Hank's hands trembled slightly as he marked the route. This man carried deep wounds from his past encounters with those who would harm the forest, and helping them was costing him more than he wanted to show. Following Hank's directions, Emily and Max ventured deeper into the wilderness, where the old logging trails twisted through increasingly challenging terrain. The afternoon sun filtered through the dense canopy, creating shifting shadows that seemed to dance around them. The sound of rushing water grew louder with each step, until they found themselves facing their next obstacle, a fast-moving river that cut through the forest like a liquid ribbon. Emily studied the churning waters with growing concern. The river, swollen from recent rains, was wider and more turbulent than she had anticipated. Max seemed equally hesitant, pacing along the riverbank as if searching for the safest crossing point. The bear's natural instincts, which had guided them so faithfully thus far, were now telling them both that this crossing required careful consideration. "We need to find a narrower point," Emily muttered, more to herself than to Max. She remembered Hank's warnings about the river, how its seemingly calm surface could hide treacherous currents beneath. They began moving upstream, following the riverbank while keeping to the cover of the forest's edge. The discovery came unexpectedly. Partially hidden behind a fallen log, Emily spotted something that made her heart skip a beat. A two-way radio, presumably dropped by one of the hunters. She picked it up carefully, checking if it still worked. The crackle of static confirmed it was functional, and suddenly, voices emerged from the speaker. "Check the north sector again," a gruff voice commanded. "That trap was deliberately sprung. Someone's interfering with our operation." Emily quickly lowered the volume, but kept listening, her mind racing with the implications of this find. The radio could be both a blessing and a curse. It would allow them to monitor the hunters' movements, but its presence meant they were closer to danger than she had realized. Max's sudden alertness drew her attention back to their immediate challenge. The bear had found something, a section of the river where a massive fallen tree created a natural, if precarious, bridge across the waters. The trunk was wide enough to walk on, but slick with moss and spray from the river below. Emily took a deep breath, securing the radio in her backpack. "Well, Max," she said quietly, "I guess this is our best option." The bear watched her with those intelligent eyes, waiting for her to make the first move. The trust between them had grown stronger with each challenge they overcame together. Carefully, Emily began her crossing. The bark beneath her feet was slippery, requiring her complete concentration. The roar of the river below seemed to grow louder with each step, its spray creating a fine mist that made the crossing even more treacherous. She was halfway across when it happened. Her foot slipped on the wet surface, and for one heart-stopping moment, she felt herself losing balance. In that crucial moment, Max demonstrated a remarkable understanding of the situation. The bear had followed her onto the log and now pressed his body against the trunk, creating a stable presence that helped Emily regain her balance. The gesture was so deliberate, so careful, that it left no doubt about his intelligence and dedication to their shared journey. Once safely across, Emily turned to watch Max complete his own crossing. The bear moved with surprising grace, his powerful form perfectly balanced despite the challenging conditions. When he reached her side, Emily found herself reaching out to touch his fur briefly, a gesture of gratitude that would have seemed unthinkable just hours ago. The radio crackled to life again, making them both freeze. "Found fresh tracks near the river," another voice reported, "heading east along the old logging trail." Emily's blood ran cold. The hunters were following their trail, and they were getting closer. She and Max needed to move quickly now, but also more carefully than ever. The radio had given them an advantage, but it also confirmed their worst fears about being pursued. They pushed deeper into the forest, leaving the river behind. The terrain became more challenging, with steep inclines and dense undergrowth that seemed designed to slow their progress. Emily's muscles ached from the constant effort, but the urgency of their mission drove her forward. Max led the way with increasing determination, his movements suggesting they were getting closer to their destination. The forest around them had changed character entirely. The trees here were ancient giants, their massive trunks creating natural corridors through the wilderness. Shafts of late afternoon sunlight penetrated the canopy, illuminating patches of mist that hung in the air like ghostly curtains. The atmosphere was both beautiful and foreboding, as if the forest itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the ancient forest as Emily and Max approached what she sensed was their destination. Max's behavior had changed subtly, his movements more cautious, his attention more focused. Every few steps, he would pause to test the air, his powerful sense of smell searching for any sign of danger. Emily found herself mimicking his vigilance, her own senses heightened by hours of moving through the wilderness. They came upon a clearing that made Emily's heart sink. The ground was littered with signs of recent human activity, fresh boot prints in the mud, broken branches, and most alarmingly, several carefully concealed traps. These weren't placed randomly, they formed a deliberate pattern, creating a barrier around what Emily suspected was Max's mother's location. "They knew," Emily whispered, the realization hitting her hard. "They knew she was injured and set these traps to catch her if she tried to move." The systematic cruelty of it made her hands shake with anger. Max watched her intently as she carefully began examining the nearest trap, looking for a way to disarm it without setting it off. The radio in her backpack crackled to life again, making them both freeze. "Team 2, check in. Any movement in Sector 7? The voice was closer now, much closer than Emily would have liked. She quickly turned down the volume, but the message was clear. The hunters were closing in on their position. With trembling fingers but determined focus, Emily started working on the first trap. Her earlier experience with freeing the deer had taught her valuable lessons about these mechanisms, but these traps were different, more complex, more dangerous. One wrong move could not only trigger the trap, but alert the hunters to their presence. Max paced anxiously nearby, his eyes constantly scanning the forest around them. The sun was getting lower, casting strange shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Each snapping twig or rustling leaf made them both tense, expecting to see hunters emerging from the growing darkness. As Emily worked on disarming the third trap, her hand slipped. The metal mechanism made a loud clicking sound that seemed to echo through the quiet forest. She froze, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Max immediately moved closer to her, his body tense and alert. The radio burst into life once more. "Did you hear that? Near the ridge." "Check it out." The voices were alarmingly clear now. The hunters were very close. Emily and Max needed to move, but moving hastily through an area filled with traps could be fatal. Making a quick decision, Emily reached into her backpack and pulled out the trail mix she'd packed that morning. With careful movements, she scattered some in the opposite direction from where they needed to go. If the hunters had dogs with them, this might buy them precious time by creating a false trail. They moved forward with agonizing slowness, Emily checking every step for signs of hidden traps while Max guided her toward their goal. The forest had grown eerily quiet, as if all its creatures were holding their breath. The only sounds were the soft whisper of wind through the leaves and, occasionally, distant voices that seemed to be moving in a circular pattern around their location. As they progressed, Emily noticed marks on the trees, deep scratches in the bark that she recognized as bear markings. They were getting close to Max's mother's refuge. The vegetation here was denser, creating natural hiding spots and corridors through the wilderness. It was perfect terrain for an injured animal to hide, but also treacherous ground for anyone trying to approach. Suddenly Max stopped, his entire body going still. Emily followed his gaze and saw what had caught his attention. A simple snare, almost invisible among the undergrowth, right in their path. But what made her blood run cold was the fresh blood on the leaves nearby. Someone, or something, had already been injured here. The discovery added new urgency to their mission. Emily's fingers moved faster now as she worked to disarm the snare. Her earlier caution balanced against the growing need to reach their destination. The sun was setting rapidly, and the forest was transforming around them, taking on the mysterious qualities of twilight. Through the growing darkness, Emily could make out a natural formation of rocks ahead, partially hidden by thick vegetation. Max's behavior told her they were nearly there. His movements had become even more careful, and he kept looking back at her with an intensity that spoke of both urgency and concern. The darkness was settling in when Emily and Max found themselves forced to take shelter in a narrow cave entrance, barely visible behind a curtain of hanging vines. The sound of voices and crackling branches had grown too close for comfort, and they needed a moment to regroup and plan their next move. The cave opening was tight. Emily had to crouch to enter, but it widened slightly once they were inside. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, Emily pulled out her flashlight, keeping the beam pointed downward to minimize any chance of it being seen from outside. What she discovered made her catch her breath. The walls of the cave were covered in marks, not random scratches, but deliberate patterns that spoke of previous inhabitants. Some were clearly from bears, deep grooves carved into the stone, but others seemed different, more purposeful. "This place has been a sanctuary before," Emily whispered, running her fingers over the marks. She could make out various patterns. Some seemed to track the seasons, others appeared to map the surrounding area. The cave walls held a history of survival, of creatures, and perhaps people who had sought refuge here over the years. Max seemed unusually calm in the cave, suggesting he was familiar with it. He moved with the certainty of someone who knew every corner of the space. Emily watched as he inspected the back of the cave, his behavior indicating this might be a regular passage he and his mother had used. The radio in Emily's backpack suddenly crackled to life. the volume thankfully low, lost the trail near the ridge, spread out and set up a perimeter. "They have to be around here somewhere." The voices were distorted by static, but close enough to make Emily's heart race. She and Max were effectively trapped in the cave, at least for the moment. Using the enforced pause to their advantage, Emily began studying the cave more carefully. Near the ground, she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat, small objects that didn't belong in a natural cave. A rusted tin cup, the remains of what might have been a first aid kit. This cave hadn't just been a temporary shelter for wildlife, it had been used by humans trying to survive in the wilderness. The discovery sparked something in Emily's mind. She thought about her own journey, how she had come to the forest seeking solitude after her loss, how she had thought she was hiding from life itself. But here she was, deep in the wilderness, risking everything to help a bear save his mother. The irony wasn't lost on her. Max's sudden alertness drew her attention back to the present. The bear's ears were pricked forward, his body tense, as he listened to something Emily couldn't hear. She switched off her flashlight, plunging them into near-total darkness. The only light came from the cave's entrance, where the last rays of sunset created a dim outline. Through that opening, they could hear the hunters moving through the forest, their voices carrying clearly in the evening air. Emily held her breath as footsteps crunched on leaves just outside their hiding place. The vines covering the entrance swayed slightly in the breeze, and for one heart-stopping moment, a beam from a flashlight swept past them. "Check the ridge above," a voice called from somewhere to their right. "These caves could hide a full-grown bear." Emily's hand found Max's fur in the darkness, drawing comfort from his solid presence. The young bear remained perfectly still, showing an understanding of their situation that continued to amaze her. In the close confines of the cave, she could feel his heart beating, its rhythm surprisingly steady despite their predicament. As they waited in tense silence, Emily's eyes continued to adjust to the darkness. The marks on the walls seemed to take on new meaning. They weren't just records of past inhabitants, but a testament to the enduring spirit of survival. Every scratch, every groove, told a story of a creature that had found safety here, had lived to mark its passage. A sudden gust of wind carried a new sound to their ears, a distant, painful growl that made Max stiffen. Emily felt him shift slightly toward the sound, and she knew without doubt that they had just heard his mother. She was close, probably in another part of this network of caves, but the hunters were between them and their goal. The marks on the walls caught Emily's attention again. Among the various scratches and patterns, she began to notice something she hadn't seen before, what appeared to be crude arrows or directional markers. If she was interpreting them correctly, they might indicate other passages through these caves, routes that the hunters wouldn't know about. The sound of approaching footsteps made Emily and Max press deeper into the shadows of the cave. But the figure that appeared at the entrance wasn't a hunter, it was Hank, moving with the silent efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime in these woods. His appearance was so unexpected that Emily almost gasped aloud. Hank's eyes, adjusted to the darkness, found them immediately. He moved into the cave with practiced ease, his body language suggesting urgency but not panic. "They've got the whole area surrounded," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of their breathing. "But I know these caves better than they ever will." The transformation in Hank was remarkable. Gone was the reluctant recluse they'd met earlier. In his place stood a man who had clearly made peace with his past and chosen to act. His years of watching and documenting the hunter's activities had prepared him for this moment, though he'd never expected to be helping a woman and a bear navigate through his beloved forest. "I've been tracking your progress," he explained, pulling out a worn map from his jacket. "You've done well to make it this far, but the next part is the trickiest. They've set up a tight perimeter around these caves. They know the mother bear is here somewhere." Emily felt a mixture of relief and apprehension at Hank's arrival. His expertise was invaluable, but his presence also confirmed the gravity of their situation. Max seemed to sense the shift in dynamics, moving closer to study the map Hank had spread on the cave floor. Using his flashlight to illuminate the map, Hank pointed out their current position and the suspected location of Max's mother. "These caves are all connected," he explained. "The hunters don't know it, but there's an old lava tube system that runs beneath this whole ridge. That's how the wildlife has managed to survive here for so long. They've always had escape routes the hunters couldn't find." The radio crackled again, making them all freeze. "Team 1, move to the eastern ridge. We've got movement near the old rockfall." The voices were clearer now, suggesting the hunters were closing in on their position. Hank's face hardened as he listened to the radio chatter. "They're using my old patrol routes," he said, a note of bitter irony in his voice. "I taught some of these men how to track years ago. Never thought they'd use those skills like this." Emily studied the map intently, trying to memorize the complex network of passages Hank was showing them. Max's attention was divided between the map and the cave entrance, his every movement suggesting growing urgency. The sound they'd heard earlier, his mother's call, had not been repeated, but its memory hung heavy in the air. "There's something else you need to know," Hank said, his voice dropping even lower. "I've contacted the local authorities. They're assembling a team, but it will take time for them to get here. We need to keep the hunters occupied and away from the bears until help arrives." The revelation that Hank had already set a larger plan in motion gave Emily hope, but it also added pressure. They weren't just trying to rescue Max's mother anymore. They were now part of a bigger operation to stop the hunters permanently. As they discussed their options, Emily noticed Max's behavior changing. The bear had moved to the cave entrance, his posture alert but not alarmed. Moments later they heard it, a bird call that seemed slightly out of place in the gathering darkness. Hank's expression changed immediately. "That's Sarah," he whispered, "another former ranger. She's been helping me document the hunters' activities. She must have followed them here." The knowledge that they had more allies than they'd realized gave Emily a surge of courage. Hank quickly rolled up his map, his movement suggesting he'd made a decision. "We need to split up," he said firmly. "I'll create a diversion on the eastern ridge. The hunters know me, know my history with them. They'll assume I'm working alone." He turned to Emily and Max. "You two follow the passage I showed you. It'll lead you around their perimeter and bring you up behind where they're focused." The plan was risky, but it was also their best chance. The hunters would be expecting confrontation from someone like Hank, a known adversary. They wouldn't be looking for a woman and a bear approaching from an unexpected direction. The underground passage Hank had shown them was narrow and challenging to navigate, but Emily and Max pressed forward, guided by necessity and determination. The beam of Emily's flashlight revealed ancient volcanic rock formations that had created this natural tunnel system, a hidden highway beneath the forest floor that had served countless creatures seeking sanctuary over the years. Their progress was slow but deliberate, each step carefully chosen to minimize noise. Above them, they could hear muffled voices and footsteps as the hunters moved across the ridge, unaware of the network of caves beneath their feet. The radio in Emily's backpack occasionally crackled with updates, allowing them to track the hunters' movements. "Eastern team, respond to Hank's location," a voice commanded through the static, "but maintain the perimeter." This could be a diversion. The hunters were experienced, Emily realized, but they were also predictable in their tactics. They were so focused on containing their quarry that they hadn't considered the possibility of underground movement. As they navigated the tunnel system, Emily noticed something remarkable. The passages they followed weren't entirely natural. Subtle marks on the walls, similar to those they'd seen in the first cave, suggested these routes had been used and maintained by both animals and humans over generations. It was as if they were traveling through a hidden history of the forest, where all its inhabitants had learned to work together for survival. Max suddenly froze, his ears perked forward. Moments later, Emily heard it too, a low, pained sound echoing through the tunnels. They were close to his mother, but the sound had an urgency to it that made Emily's heart race. The injury must be severe, and time was running out. The tunnel began to slope upward, and Emily could see a faint light ahead. As they approached, she realized they were reaching an exit point that would put them behind the hunter's perimeter, exactly as Hank had planned. But just as they were about to emerge, voices directly above made them halt. "Check those cave entrances again," someone called. "The old ranger's causing trouble on the ridge, but the bear has to be around here somewhere." The hunters' voices were closer than ever, and Emily could hear the frustration in their tones. Their carefully laid plans were being disrupted, and they were beginning to make mistakes. Through a small opening in the rock, Emily could see two hunters passing nearby, their flashlight beams cutting through the growing darkness. She held her breath, pressed against the cool stone, until they moved past. Max remained perfectly still beside her, his presence a steady comfort in the tense moment. That's when they heard Hank's voice ring out from somewhere on the ridge. "You're trespassing on protected land. The authorities have been notified." His words carried clearly through the evening air, drawing the attention of the hunters above them. The radio crackled again. "He's not alone up there. I saw movement near the western slopes. Spread out and check all approaches." The hunters' coordinated efforts were beginning to fragment as they faced resistance from multiple directions. Emily and Max seized this moment of confusion to emerge from their hiding place. They found themselves in a small clearing, partially hidden by large boulders. From this vantage point, Emily could see the hunters' positions scattered across the ridge. More importantly, she could see the entrance to another cave about 50 yards away, and fresh signs that a large animal had recently passed through. But reaching that cave meant crossing exposed ground. The growing darkness provided some cover, but the hunters' flashlights swept the area regularly. Emily's mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. They needed a distraction, something to draw attention away from their position without revealing their presence. That's when she spotted something that made her pause. One of the hunters had separated from the others and was heading their way, but something was wrong with his movement. He was limping, clearly injured, probably from the rough terrain and the chaos of the search. The man stumbled, caught himself against a tree, and Emily saw blood on his hand where he'd cut himself on sharp rocks. In that moment, Emily made a decision that would change everything. Despite the risk, despite knowing that this man was one of those threatening the forest she had come to love, she couldn't ignore someone in need of medical help. Her instinct to heal was stronger than her fear or anger. The injured hunter's labored breathing cut through the evening air as he slumped against a fallen log, clearly struggling. Emily exchanged a glance with Max, who seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. The bear stayed hidden in the shadows as Emily slowly emerged from their concealment, her hands raised to show she meant no harm. "You're hurt," she said softly, approaching the hunter with the careful movements she'd learned from dealing with injured wildlife. The man's head snapped up, his hand instinctively reaching for his radio, but the pain of movement made him gasp instead. "Don't move," Emily instructed, her voice firm but gentle. "That cut on your arm needs immediate attention." She could see now that his injury was worse than she'd initially thought. A deep gash that would require proper medical care. The first aid kit in her backpack suddenly felt like the most important thing she carried. The hunter watched her with a mixture of suspicion and desperation as she knelt beside him. "Why would you help me?" he managed to ask through gritted teeth. "You're with the old ranger, aren't you? The one trying to stop us?" Emily cleaned the wound with steady hands, her voice calm as she worked. "I'm here because a mother bear needs help and her cub came to find me. She gestured slightly toward Max, who had remained partially hidden but visible enough to make the hunter's eyes widen in disbelief. "That's impossible," he whispered, watching Max with a combination of fear and wonder. "Bears don't..." His voice trailed off as he observed Max's clearly intelligent and non-threatening behavior. As Emily bandaged his arm, she continued speaking softly about the forest, about the delicate balance of life there, and about the consequences of their actions. The hunter, whose name she learned was Tom, listened with growing uncertainty. His own pain had made him vulnerable to empathy, and seeing Max's gentle nature was challenging everything he'd believed about these animals. "We didn't know," Tom finally said, his voice heavy with realization. "They told us this was just another hunting operation, but the traps, the organization... It's all wrong, isn't it?" His radio crackled with demands for his location, but he made no move to answer it. The sound of approaching footsteps made them all tense, but it was Hank who emerged from the darkness, followed by Sarah, the former ranger he'd mentioned earlier. They took in the scene, Emily tending to the injured hunter, Max watching calmly nearby, with expressions of surprise and growing hope. "Tom," Hank said, recognition in his voice. "I remember when you were just a kid, learning to track deer with your father. He taught you respect for the forest, didn't he? What happened to that?" The hunter looked away, shame evident in his features. "The money was good," he admitted, "and it was easy to pretend we were just regular hunters, but seeing this..." He gestured toward Max. "Seeing how that bear sought help, how this woman risked everything to help both me and the bears. I can't be part of this anymore." Sarah stepped forward, her ranger training evident in her confident movements. "The authorities are on their way," she informed them. "We have enough evidence to shut this operation down permanently. But we need to get to the mother bear before the others do." Tom's radio crackled again, more urgently this time. After a moment's hesitation, he picked it up. "East side is clear," he reported, his voice steady despite his pain. "Moving to check the western ridge." He looked at the others. "That should keep them away from where you need to go." Emily finished securing the bandage, her heart racing with the knowledge that they were so close to their goal. The hunter's change of heart had given them an unexpected advantage, but time was still critical. Max had grown increasingly restless, sensing their proximity to his mother. Hank quickly outlined a plan. "Sarah and I will help Tom get to the access road where the authorities can find him. Emily, you and Max go now. The entrance to the main cave system is just beyond those rocks. The other hunters will be focused on the western ridge, thanks to Tom's message." As Emily prepared to leave with Max, Tom caught her arm. "The trap," he said urgently. "The one that caught the mother bear. It's different from the others, more complex. Be careful." The genuine concern in his voice suggested his transformation was real, born from experiencing unexpected kindness in a moment of vulnerability. The cave entrance loomed before them, a dark mouth in the gathering dusk. Emily's flashlight beam revealed a pathway that bore signs of recent passage, disturbed earth, broken twigs, and most tellingly, spots of blood that made Max whimper softly. The sound broke Emily's heart, but it also strengthened her resolve. They were so close now. Inside, the cave opened into a larger chamber than they'd expected. The beam of Emily's flashlight danced across the walls, revealing more of the mysterious markings they'd seen earlier. But what caught their attention was the sound, a low, pained growl coming from deeper within the cave system. Max's reaction was immediate. He moved forward with purpose, but also with caution, aware of Tom's warning about the complex trap. Emily followed closely, her every step careful and measured. The chamber narrowed into a tunnel, then opened again into an even larger space. And there she was, Max's mother, a magnificent creature even in her distress. The trap had caught her back leg, the mechanism more sophisticated than anything Emily had encountered before. The bear's eyes, though clouded with pain, showed the same intelligence she'd seen in Max. When the younger bear approached, she made a soft sound of recognition that brought tears to Emily's eyes. "It's okay," Emily whispered, though she knew it was more for her own comfort than the bear's. "We're going to help you." She approached slowly, letting the mother bear become accustomed to her presence. Max moved between them, his behavior clearly communicating trust to his mother. The trap was indeed unlike the others. Emily studied it carefully, her mind racing to understand its mechanism. Her experience with the previous traps helped, but this one was clearly designed to be difficult to disarm. One wrong move could make things worse. Suddenly, voices echoed from the cave entrance. The other hunters had discovered their location. Time was running out. Emily's hands moved faster, working on the trap with desperate precision. Max stood guard, his attention divided between his mother and the approaching danger. "Check every chamber," a voice commanded, closer now. "They have to be in here somewhere." Emily's fingers found what seemed to be the trap's release mechanism, but something wasn't right. It was too easy, too obvious. Tom's warning rang in her ears. Looking closer, she spotted the real mechanism, cleverly hidden beneath what appeared to be the main release. The sound of footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the beams of flashlights playing across the cave walls. Emily's heart pounded, but her hands remained steady as she worked. Max's mother watched her with surprising calmness, as if understanding that this human was different from those who had hurt her. Just as the first hunter appeared at the chamber's entrance, Emily found the right combination. The trap released with a soft click, freeing the mother bear's leg. The hunter froze at the sight before him, a woman kneeling beside two bears, neither showing any sign of aggression. "Stop!" another voice called from behind him. It was Sarah, arriving with perfect timing. "Federal authorities are outside. It's over." More voices joined her, these carrying the authority of law enforcement. The hunter slowly lowered his flashlight, the fight seeming to drain out of him as he took in the scene. The mother bear, despite her injury, rose to her full height, not aggressively, but with a dignity that commanded respect. Max stayed close to her side, while Emily stepped back, giving them space. The chamber filled with new voices and lights as authorities swarmed in, but Emily barely noticed them. Her attention was fixed on Max and his mother, watching their reunion with tears in her eyes. The bigger bear nuzzled her cub, their connection palpable even to the hardened law enforcement officers who now filled the cave. In the days that followed, the Klamath Forest began its journey back to peace. The mother bear's injuries, though serious, were healing well under the care of wildlife veterinarians who had set up a temporary treatment station near the cave system. Emily visited daily, watching with joy as both bears grew stronger. Max never strayed far from his mother, but he always acknowledged Emily's presence with a gentle look that spoke volumes about their shared journey. Hank had undergone his own transformation. The former ranger who had hidden from the world now stood tall again, working with authorities to document the cave systems and establish better protections for the forest's wildlife. His years of careful observation and mapping had proved invaluable in dismantling the hunter's operation completely. "You know," he said to Emily one evening as they watched the sunset from his cabin's porch, "I thought I was protecting the forest by staying hidden, by just watching. But sometimes protection means taking action, even when it's scary." His eyes had lost their haunted look, replaced by a quiet determination. Sarah had taken on the role of lead ranger in the area, her experience and passion making her the perfect choice to oversee the forest's recovery. Under her guidance, new conservation measures were being implemented, and the cave system was being designated as a protected wildlife sanctuary. Even Tom, the injured hunter who had helped them in the end, found a new purpose. After recovering from his injuries, he began working with wildlife rehabilitation programs. His first-hand experience with Max's intelligence and compassion driving him to protect what he had once hunted. Emily's own transformation was perhaps the most profound. The woman who had come to the forest to hide from life had found herself by fighting for it instead. Her cabin, once a refuge from the world, became a meeting point for forest rangers and wildlife researchers, its walls now covered with maps and wildlife photographs instead of memories of loss. One crisp morning, about a month after the rescue, Emily stood at the edge of her clearing, watching Max and his mother prepare to return to the deeper forest. The mother bear's leg had healed well enough for them to resume their natural life in the wilderness. Max approached Emily one last time, his eyes meeting hers with an intelligence that still amazed her. "Thank you," she whispered, knowing that simple phrase couldn't capture the depth of what she felt. The young bear pressed his head gently against her hand, one final gesture of connection before turning to follow his mother into the forest. Emily watched them disappear among the trees, her heart full of emotions she couldn't quite name. Later that evening, as she sat on her porch with a cup of tea, Emily reflected on how one desperate bear cub had changed so many lives. The forest around her felt different now, not just a hiding place, but a living community she was part of. The sounds of nocturnal creatures beginning their nightly routines filled the air, and somewhere in the distance, she heard a bear's contented growl. Hank joined her on the porch, laying a worn notebook on the table between them. "I've been thinking," he said. "People need to hear this story, not just about the bears, but about how nature can heal us if we let it." He opened the notebook, revealing years of observations and sketches of forest life. "Maybe it's time to share what we've learned." Emily smiled, understanding what he meant. Their experience had shown them that the forest's greatest strength lay not in its isolation, but in the connections it fostered, between animals and humans, between past and present, between loss and healing. In her backpack, next to her first aid kit, she still carried the radio they had found that fateful day. It now served as a reminder that sometimes the most important messages aren't transmitted through words, but through actions, through courage, and through the willingness to help others, even when they seem different from us. The story of Max and his mother became a symbol of hope for the Klamath Forest, inspiring a new generation of conservationists and wildlife protectors. People came from far and wide to learn about the bear cub who sought human help and the woman who answered his call. But for Emily, the real miracle wasn't in the dramatic rescue. It was in the daily reminder that healing comes in many forms, and that sometimes, by helping others, we find our own way home. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Emily, Max, and the Klamath Forest has touched your hearts as deeply as it has touched ours. The bond between humans and nature is precious and deserves our protection. For more inspiring tales of courage, compassion, and the healing power of nature, subscribe to our channel and click the like button. Share your own stories of connection with nature in the comments below. Together, we can ensure that stories like this continue to inspire and remind us of our responsibility to protect the wild places and creatures that share our world. Join us tomorrow for another extraordinary journey into the heart of human experience.